That's not what I said. I was talking about an OnlyFans company when that question was asked. But I said that if a woman is going out with a man, she belongs to that man. That's his woman. So she wants to do OnlyFans. She owes him some money because she's his. Yeah, I don't know, because I think the women belong to the man. I think the woman's given over.
That's inherently where
subject is cheating. If your man does cheat, the most stupid thing you can do is leave him.
Okay, so that voice. If you've been on social media literally any time in the past couple of years, you know exactly who that is.
Andrew Tate. And here's what's wild. In July of 2022, more people were Googling his name than Donald Trump and Kim Kardashian combined.
Which is actually insane if you think about it, because 6 months before that, almost no one knew who he was.
Welcome back to the Psychology of Virality. I'm Pranav, head of content.
I'm Aditya, executive producer.
And I'm Anirudha, head of research. And today we're talking about what happens when everything we learned in episode 1 about emotional triggers, relatability, algorithmic timing gets weaponized.
So, quick recap. Last episode we broke down the mechanics of how content goes viral. High arousal emotions like anger or awe, relatability factor, hitting the algorithm at the right time. We looked at Zohar Mamdani using genuine anger about housing policy. Bella Rose simplifying political concepts might be a little too much.
And we established that virality isn't really luck. It's a formula. You can engineer it if you understand the psychology and the platform mechanics.
Which brings us to the question we kept avoiding in the last episode. What happens when people use that formula not to inform necessarily, or not to build community, but to spread misinformation, or to build a cult-like following, or to profit off of vulnerable audiences?
Because that's exactly what Andrew Tate did. And the scary part, his strategy is now being studied and copied by countless other creators.
So today, we're going deeper. We're looking at Andrew Tate as a case study in the algorithmic manipulation. We're going to talk about how misinformation spreads through these same viral mechanics. And we have an interview with Dr. Ethan Zuckerman,
who literally wrote the book on mistrust in institutions and attention economics. He's the guy.
And we're going to talk about the hard questions. Like, when virality determines what information reaches people, and that virality can be engineered, what does that mean for truth? For democracy? For just like basic shared reality?
But first, we need to understand exactly what Andrew Tate did, because it's honestly kind of genius in a deeply disturbing way.
All right, so Andrew Tate, former kickboxer turned self-help guru, turned one of the most controversial figures on the internet. But before we get into his exact tactics, we need to understand what exactly he was trying to say.
And this is important to note. We're not endorsing any of his views. His content is widely considered misogynistic, promotes toxic masculinity, and has been linked to real harm, especially among young men.
Teachers literally stated, reporting that their male students were repeating his talking points in class. There was this viral Reddit post from a male teacher describing, quote, terrifying rise of incel and misogynistic rhetoric, end quote, in his schools, directly tied to Tate's influence.
Right. So his message itself isn't the innovative part. The misogyny he was pushing isn't really new. It's been around forever. But what was new was how he spread it.
Let me give you some numbers that will help you understand the scale. In just 3 months, May to August 2022, he went from under 1 million Instagram followers to 4.6 million.
His content got 11.6 billion views on TikTok. Not millions, billion with a B.
And here's the real kicker. He was banned from TikTok. All those views came from other people posting clips of him.
Which is exactly the strategy. And this is where it gets fascinating from a virality perspective.
So Tate had this program called Hustlers University. On the surface, it was supposed to teach men how to make money, how to be successful, all of the typical hustle culture stuff.
But the real genius, or depending on your perspective, the real manipulation, was in how he used affiliate marketing to turn his students into his distribution network.
Hold on, explain that for people who don't know what affiliate marketing is.
Right. So affiliate marketing is when you promote someone else's product and get a commission when someone buys through your referral. Pretty standard online business model. But Tate's twist was that when you joined Hustlers University, the main thing he taught you wasn't actually how to build a business.
He taught you how to promote him.
Exactly. He gave his students a very specific playbook. Take clips from his podcast appearances, edit them into short form content optimized for TikTok and Instagram Reels, and flood multiple platforms with them. So basically, if someone clicked on your clip and signed up for Hustlers University, you got a cut.
So suddenly he had thousands of people acting as his promotional team, all financially incentivized to make him go viral.
And here's where the algorithmic piece comes in, because the algorithm doesn't know or care that these are paid promoters. It just sees, oh, lots of different accounts are posting about this Andrew Tate guy, and people are watching these videos along the way, and they're commenting. This must be important content.
Exactly. So the algorithm starts pushing his content to more and more people, which creates more engagement. This just creates a positive feedback loop, which makes the algorithm push it harder. And it wasn't an artificially jump-started by this affiliate army.
There's actually a term for this type of approach. It's called the Andrew Tate model. Mr. Beast talked about it on a podcast. The strategy is go on tons of podcasts, create clippable moments, and let other people spread your content for you.
But Tate took it a step further by actually paying people to spread the content through this commission structure.
Okay, but here's the other layer. The content itself was engineered for maximum virality. Let's walk you through his rhetorical tactics because they're straight out of the playbook we discussed from last episode, just amplified a bit more.
Hit us with it.
First, he used what's called progressive agreeability. You start by saying 2 or 3 things that are very easy to agree with, like men should work hard, or you should take care of your family, or be strong for the people you love.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Then it gets people nodding along. Then once you've conditioned them to agree with you, you throw in something controversial or extreme, like, and that's why men should control their wives' money.
Whoa.
Yeah. And by that point, some people are already in agreement mode. So they're more likely to accept the controversial statement. But even if they don't, even if they're horrified, they're still engaging with them.
Because that's the second tactic. He said things specifically designed to create strong reactions from both sides.
The polarization strategy.
Exactly. His clips were designed to be shared by supporters who agreed and by critics who were outraged. Every angry quote tweet, every reaction video from someone debunking him, every discussion about how harmful his views were, all just amplified his reach.
There's research backing this up as well. A study from NYU found that on Twitter, content expressing moral outrage spreads 20% faster for every word related to moral emotional language. Tate's content was designed to trigger that exact response.
So whether you loved him or hated him, you probably were talking about him. And every time you talked about him, you were doing his marketing for him.
There's one more tactic we need to talk about, the enemy narrative.
Oh, the Matrix thing.
Exactly. So Tate constantly talked about the Matrix, in quotes, this vague evil force of mainstream media, government, corporations, trying to keep men weak and compliant.
Classic us versus them framing.
And it's really effective because it makes his followers feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. They're not just watching content, they're soldiers in a battle against a corrupt system.
This is storytelling 101, right? Every good story needs an enemy to build tension. But Tate weaponized the narrative structure to create almost a cult-like loyalty.
And when he eventually got banned from platforms, he spun that as proof. See? The Matrix is trying to silence me because I'm telling the truth.
So let's pause right here and connect this back to what we learned in episode 1. Tate used high arousal emotions, anger at the system, outrage from critics. He established extreme reliability with young men who felt lost or disenfranchised. He gamed the algorithm using volume and affiliate marketing, and he hit at exactly the right time when these platforms were optimized for short-form content and controversy-driven engagement.
Every single mechanism we identified in episode 1, he exploited. But the outcome wasn't just viral fame. It was the spread of genuinely harmful ideologies to millions of young men.
And that's sort of what we want to dig into now. Not just how virality works, But what happens when it's used this way? And what are its consequences?
Okay, so we've established how Tate went viral. Now, let's talk about what that virality actually did.
Because this isn't just about one guy with bad opinions getting famous. This is about the viral attention economy shapes what information reaches people who they trust and what they believe is true.
So I want to bring up something we touched on last episode. The idea that online credibility isn't about expertise anymore. It's about parasocial closeness, making your audience feel like they truly know you.
And Tate was a master at that, right? He talked about his own struggles, his journey from being broke to wealthy, his relationship with his brother. Very personal, very relatable, just right for his target audience.
But the information he was spreading about gender dynamics, about success, about how the world looks, was factually wrong, or at least extremely biased. Yet, many people trusted him anyways, especially young men.
And this connects to broader research on how misinformation spreads. There's a concept in psychology called identity protective cognition. Basically, we're more likely to believe information that comes from someone we see as part of our in group, even when that information contradicts expert consensus.
So, for young men who felt like Tate understood them, represented them, they were primed to believe him over, say, actual relationships experts like sociologists or whoever.
Because the sociologist feels distant, academic, not part of their world. Tate feels close, one of them.
Exactly. And platforms like TikTok and Instagram amplify this effect because the algorithm shows you more content from people who are like you, who speak your language, who share your frustrations. It creates these echo chambers where certain narratives just get reinforced over and over, pushing it into your mind.
So, here's where we wanted to bring in an expert who's been studying exactly these dynamics, Professor Ethan Zuckerman from UMass Amherst.
Ethan Zuckerman is the director of Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure, former director of MIT's Center for Civic Media, and he wrote a book called Mistrust about why people are losing faith in institutions.
And his research on attention economics and how media attention is distributed globally is probably the most relevant work to understanding the consequences of engineered virality.
We're going to play our interview with him in just a moment, but I want to frame what we asked him about because we went into this interview with some specific questions.
First, we wanted to understand when attention becomes something that can be engineered through psychological triggers and algorithms rather than earned experience or accuracy, what happens to public discourse? What information gets heard and what gets ignored?
Second, we asked about the trust crisis. Is the virality driven attention economy accelerating the breakdown of trust in traditional institutions? And if people are trusting viral creators over experts, what does that mean for society?
Third, the civic implications. When viral political content is optimized for emotional engagement rather than accuracy or nuance, how does that affect our ability to have productive democratic conversations?
And finally, we asked him about solutions. He's a big advocate for what he calls digital public infrastructure, alternative models for social media that aren't driven by engagement metrics and ad revenue. We wanted to know if that's realistic, or if we're stuck with the system we have.
So without further ado, here's our conversation with Dr. Ethan Zuckerman.
Okay.
Excellent.
Aditya, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So we just have 4 quick questions for you to take around 15 to 20 minutes. I would assume around 6 minutes per question.
I read them. They're not quick questions, but we'll make it work. Don't worry about it.
Okay, yes. But yeah, question 1. So you've written extensively about attention economics and how media is distributed. When attention becomes something that can be engineered through psychological triggers and algorithms rather than earned through expertise or accuracy, what are the consequences for public discourse? How does the shift change what information reaches people and what gets ignored, especially in light of your work and the dynamics of attention?
Yeah, so let me just start with an intro because maybe you'll want it for it. But my name's Ethan Zuckerman. I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I've been here for about 5 years. I teach in 3 different departments here. I teach in public policy, communication, and computer science. And I spend a lot of time thinking about social media, the internet, and the public sphere. So, in the context of all of that, let me sort of go after that question. Um, we talk a lot these days about economies of attention because it's become a really good way to sort of understand social media. We have people who, some of which are political actors, some of which are commercial actors, all competing for our attention. Everybody wants to be an influencer. Everybody wants to be shaping the dialogue in one fashion or another. If you're a political candidate running for office, you need some of that attention, and you can either earn it or you can buy it. You can buy ads or you can sort of earn your way into it. Lots of individuals want that attention as well. People want to feel like they have a voice in the political process. People want to feel like they can share their ideas in one fashion or another. We know that attention has become valuable because it's scarce. It is the scarce commodity. It used to be the ability to speak that was scarce. It used to be hard to get hold of a printing press. It used to be hard to get hold of a broadcast mic. But you guys now produce a podcast as high schoolers. I produce a podcast as a professor. What's hard is for anyone to get anyone to pay attention to us. The way you get attention these days is rewarded by algorithms. And algorithms have a particular logic to them. Almost all the algorithms that we care about want people to use them over and over and over again. So when Instagram is trying to decide what to give attention to, it wants its users to be excited, it wants them to engage with something, it wants them to keep scrolling Instagram. So it's looking for emotion, it's looking for fascination, but it doesn't want you to go away for a long time. It doesn't want you to go, read a 10-page article. It wants you to be sort of excited about it and then sort of keep on scrolling. And so these algorithms have certain cues, certain triggers associated with them. They're very good at giving attention to highly emotional material. Sometimes it's material that makes you angry. Sometimes it's material that makes you joyful. What it really cares about is that high emotional trigger. It doesn't care very much about whether it's true or not, or whether it's verified. And so this all has an effect on our public sphere. If you go back 30 years when we were in a broadcast world, we had a lot more in common. Most of us saw the same evening news. We could generally agree on what were the big news stories of the day. If we went out and asked people, what are the big crises in the world, you would get some diversity, but you would also get significantly more consensus. Right now, our ability to agree on that really depends on what we're getting from the algorithm. And what you get from the algorithm, what I get from the algorithm, could turn out to be very, very different. So we've been worried as long as I've been alive about polarization between left and right in the US. People on the left, people on the right can't talk to one another. We're now coming up with a new form of polarization in which everybody is their own pole. Everybody has the set of issues that they care about. Everybody has the sources and voices that they listen to. And the problem is there's very little that's in common at this point. And that is probably very dangerous for a democracy. In a democracy, not only do we have to govern ourselves, we have to govern everybody else in our society. And if we don't know what's important to them, if we don't know what they're facing, we're very poorly prepared for that. So right now, we seem to have a public sphere. We seem to have an environment that we are interacting within that's making it really hard to take action in a democratic society.
So, quick follow-up. I want to mainly focus on algorithms. When you say algorithms, are you talking about recommendation systems specifically, or is it like broader, like the entire architecture of how these platforms like surface content?
Yep. So let me start with a saying from my friend Kathy O'Neill, who says an algorithm is an opinion embedded in math. So she's got a wonderful book called Weapons of Math Destruction. It's looking at how algorithms come into different parts of our life. When I'm saying algorithm, I'm basically referring to a system in which we don't necessarily have a whole lot of control over what we see. We've outsourced most of that control to the Facebook feed, the Instagram feed, the TikTok feed. We've outsourced it to search engine algorithms deciding what comes up first. We've outsourced it to large language models that end up deciding what sources they're going to use to answer our questions. All of those are governed by algorithms, and the vast majority of those algorithms are engaged in the attention economy. So Instagram wants to keep your attention to make money. OpenAI and ChatGPT increasingly are engaged in the same game, and they're trying to keep your attention, which means that that may affect how they're answering questions for you. They're not just giving you the answers, but they're giving them to you in a way that keeps you coming back and keeps you asking more. So absolutely, some of this is about how social media sorts its feeds. But really what it is any case in which we're giving up our individual choice to some sort of algorithm, some sort of opinion embedded in math that thinks it knows better.
Yeah, just a quick question on what you said before that. I really like your idea about everyone has their own polar. Because one of the things what we talked about in episode one was that, back in the day, the New York Times, for example, they were the big, governing, I guess, like publication source back in the day. And everyone kind of got their news from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and that kind of formed people's beliefs about certain issues. And I heard like President Richard Nixon said that the media has the most power back in the 1970s, not the president, not the executive, not the legislation branch, the media. So now with social media, you're talking about how everyone has their own polarization. Could you explain a bit more into that? Like how the social media kind of shape that individual perspective of polarization rather than this collective polarization?
Yeah. So let's go back to Nixon for a second, right? So Nixon is coming out of broadcast media. So he's very worried about what the New York Times has to say. He's very worried about what CBS News has to say. He's looking at these individual, very powerful voices. And the truth is, communication scholars have gone and looked at, TV news during the 1960s, during the 1970s. 90% of what was on those different broadcasts, ABC, NBC, CBS, was the same thing. You had a great deal of consensus about this is what's news today, this is what we're going to pay attention to. We are now in an internet age, which means we have vastly more choice. We don't just have to listen to the New York Times, although we can listen to the Daily, which is pretty great. We can listen to your podcast, to my podcast, any number of other people out there putting information out there. So diversity of voices is no longer scarce. There's an incredible number of voices. Attention is scarce. And what we do is we end up using the algorithms to help us with attention. Either we end up using the algorithms on something like Instagram or TikTok to sort of say what's going to be interesting to me, or we lean on a different algorithm to go onto Google or to go onto ChatGPT and say, I want to read something about climate change in American cities, and then those algorithms end up sort of shaping it for us. So the power went from what we called gatekeepers, the editors of newspapers, the broadcasters, to algorithmic gatekeepers, right? So now the power is Facebook's algorithm, TikTok's algorithm, Google's algorithm. The trick is, rather than that algorithm deciding on one thing, it decides on one thing for each of us. So if you and I go on TikTok,
That is you saying that women are your property.
It's not about being property. It's about the fact that she belongs to him and the intimate parts of her body belong to him because they're in a relationship. And if she wants to sell those, he has a stake in those intimate parts of her body.
That makes us happy because that's what the algorithm is optimizing for. Maybe neither of us gets political content. Maybe neither of us gets news content. Maybe we do, but maybe we get very different content. The problem is we probably don't have anything in common. And so when you go and you sort of say, hey, the government should really do something about prison overcrowding, and you go and say, what the heck are you talking about? I have no idea whether that's an issue. Well, I know it's an issue because it's on the top of my TikTok feed, but on the top of your TikTok feed is the price of electricity and how it's going up from data centers. This used to be something called agenda setting. Media had enormous amount of power to say, this is what we ought to think about. And so even if it didn't tell us what to think, we could at least agree on what to think about. We're no longer getting that single agenda set by media. Instead, we're all getting different agendas set by algorithmic media.
Yeah, honestly, like just like looking into this, like your examples, everything from like TikTok algorithms to Instagram, I can see that, right? Even with me and Aditya, like we have varying feeds, we have varying topics to like talk about. Like just one last hypothetical before we move on to the next question.
Sure.
So how would you propose a algorithm that is able to not be hyper individualistic, but still retain attention so it can be successful in the market?
Yeah. So we actually just talked about this in the class that I just finished teaching. So I teach a class called Defending Democracy in a Digital World. And we were talking about an article from 1993. It's by a guy named Nick Negroponte. He's the founder of MIT's Media Lab. Wrote a pretty terrific book called Being Digital. And he ended up predicting in 1993, so a long time ago, that we would end up with personalized news. And one of the things that he ended up saying was this personalized news, the daily me, would be really useful to us during the week, but we really needed to have something that we all held in common on the weekend. And he called that the daily we. So you would get your hyper custom news part of the week, and then you would have something that sort of pulled us all together on the weekend and put us together in that same place. I think we don't have enough work right now thinking about what is it that all holds us in common. I've got a friend, Taylor Owen, he teaches up at McGill in Montreal, and he said, Canada was really resistant to conspiracy theories until about 5 or 6 years ago. And the reason for it was that even though a lot of American media makes it into Canada, everybody watched CBC. And so at the end of the day, everyone could kind of agree that what was on CBC was the truth. And over the course of 5 or 6 years, CBC has kind of lost its centrality. Fewer and fewer people are watching broadcast television. Meta doesn't allow links to Canadian news sites. And so CBC doesn't have as much weight as it used to have on things like Facebook or Instagram. And it's kind of lost that anchor. And unfortunately, the Canadian media ecosystem is starting to sort of spin out of control as a result. We might need something we all have in common. Maybe it's imperfect, maybe it's a compromise, but maybe we all pay attention to it. And whether it's the New York Times or the CBC or something, these days it's probably Wikipedia. It would be really useful if we could all agree that something is true.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. We probably do need something, at least some sort of standardized news, some sort of metric we can use to evaluate like information and look to get truthful information. So moving on from like the algorithmic side of things to individual creators. As we've seen, viral creators often gain trust by positioning themselves as one of us, even when their information is inaccurate. In your book, Mistrust, you explore the erosion of faith in traditional institutions. Is the virality-driven attention economy accelerating this breakdown? How does this reshape who we trust and why, particularly for institutions like journalism, academia, and government?
I ended up writing Mistrust 6 or 7 years ago. I was at MIT, and I was trying to figure out the politics of my students. And what I was mostly figuring out was that with only a few exceptions, most of my students thought that political engagement was basically bullshit. They just didn't have any interest in getting involved with a political campaign or getting involved with a political party. They saw other ways of making change, and they were very socially conscious. They were very aware of issues that they wanted to make a change on, but they were skeptical that electing somebody or passing a law could do it. And they were skeptical that a lot of the institutions that we had would be successful. And so I started looking at this question, and the obvious question was, did social media somehow lead to mistrust in institutions? And the answer is actually pretty straightforward. And the answer is no. It's much, much earlier than that. And it's earlier than you probably think. So Gallup, which is this big polling organization, has been asking Americans about their trust in different types of institutions for decades now. So they asked this question, do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time? And if you go back to 1964, okay, 1964 is when my father is graduating from college, right? So he's now in his early 80s. So that's a long time ago. In 1964, 77% of Americans say that they trust the US government to do the right thing all or most of the time. You ask that same question now, and you'll get between 13 and 15% of people saying that they trust the US government. So that's an enormous, enormous shift. And so you look at that and you sort of go, well, geez, we really hit rock bottom. The interesting thing about this is that we make it down to only 25% of people trusting the government by the 1970s. So the 1970s is this collapse of trust. And if we sort of go back in American history, and this is fairly distant history for me as well as for you guys, like some of this unfolds sort of when I'm a kid, some of it is before my time. But it's the Vietnam War, it's Watergate, it's Richard Nixon, I am not a crook, and obviously he is a crook. It's Gerald Ford coming in after Nixon and then pardoning the president, who was obviously a criminal. It's Jimmy Carter having this very ineffective presidency and having hostages taken in Iran. The 70s are a mess. And it turns out that during the 1970s, people's confidence in government goes way, way down. It's gone up and down since then, but this sort of unshakable, like, we've got it, we're America, it's going to be great, that's really like a mid-1960s thing. And you can look at other institutions and see where the trust in them starts to quaver. So, banks, 2008 financial collapse, right? Banks lend way too much money to people to buy houses, crashes the whole economy. We've had low trust in the banking system since then. Americans have very low trust in religion. You can trace a lot of that back to the Boston Globe doing reporting on the Catholic Church shuttling around pedophile priests rather than kicking them out of the ranks. So in a lot of cases, you can see these moments where we lose trust in an institution. One of the things that I found in the Mistrust book was that the only institutions that Americans trust now more than they did in the 1970s are the military and small business. Small business isn't an institution, right? That's individuals. We trust individuals quite a bit more than we trust institutions. Trust in the military, that's not so great. That's actually something that happens in countries that are losing their democracy. And they look at it and say, well, maybe the army could do a better job of running this than we do it right now. So what's happening with social media influencers, what's happening with individuals showing up and saying, I'm, just like you, it's just like us, that's people playing with institutional mistrust and saying, I'm not an institution, I'm an individual. You can trust me because I'm an individual person, not speaking with an institutional voice. And that trick works fairly well. That trick worked really well for Donald Trump, who ended up saying, I'm not a politician. I'm a unique individual. I know how the system works. I know how broken it is. But look at me. I'm a successful individual. I'm not part of the system. And both times Donald Trump has won, he's won because a lot of people look at the institutions we have in society and go, well, geez, those aren't doing so well. Maybe we need someone who's entirely outside of these processes. Personally, that's not how I would choose to solve this situation, but it's a good way to sort of explain why it's a moment where individuals, and particularly individuals who claim that they're anti-institution, are particularly powerful at this moment in time.
Yeah, our last episode we talked about, sorry, we talked about Zoran Mamdani. I think he has a lot of similarities to this, kind of anti-establishment, type rhetoric. And I heard your point about how, from the 1960s and on, this trust in the system has kind of gone down. But even then, in some years, like 1980 was sort of like a unanimous election. I think every state voted for Ronald Reagan except maybe two.
Yep.
So would you say that it's kind of fluctuating? Like sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. And if so, why do some people have this sort of appeal?
So, I'm old enough to remember the Reagan election. Reagan is a great example of this sort of unusual individual. Yes, he was the governor of California. Yes, he had been, involved with organized politics for a while, but he was also kind of very much coming out of, me, I'm an actor, I'm an individual. So he's actually kind of an interesting example of the sort of individual trumping party. But yeah, absolutely. He had a high level of presidential confidence and trust. We've had other moments of this. George W. Bush had incredible trust at the moment that he decided to invade Iraq. 9/11 went a long way towards uniting Americans instead of saying, okay, we're all on the same page, we trust where this is going. But the overall trend has been an anti-institution trend. Mamdani's interesting in that I don't hear him saying, only I, Mamdani, can fix it. What he's really saying is, here is a new set of ideas that actually could work. And those ideas are pretty unfamiliar. There are not a lot of cities that are saying subsidized grocery stores, free buses, occasionally in Europe, things like highly subsidized public transit. But that's fairly out of the ordinary for the US political vocabulary. And so he's able to say something very different than what Trump is saying. He's saying, yeah, I'm going to do something quite different from what the people who came before me. But then he's putting forward a policy plan rather than putting forward a personality. And what's going to be very interesting is to see, can that work? Can the policies win? Or is he going to have to become kind of an avatar of the policies in the way that Trump has become the avatar for MAGA? We'll see.
Yeah, I personally find that really interesting. I kind of view Zoran's being elected as kind of this pivotal point, at least from what I can see, as to see how democracy changes, how we're going to see a new blue party, what the future is going to look like for policies. And I feel like this is a great transition into civic implementations and like the fragmented public sphere. So you've written about how social media is fragmenting the public sphere into echo chambers, where emotional engagement rather than nuance dominates, when virality amplifies emotional and decisive content. What happens to our ability to productive democratic discourse? How do we distinguish between virality that serves democratic goals and virality that deepens polarization or spreads misinformation?
So I think with this question, we actually have to be a little careful of idealizing democracy. So, amazing thinker named Michael Schudson. He's one of the best scholars on the history of the press and democracy. is at Columbia University, writes a book called The Good Citizen. And what inspires him to write this book is he is a poll watcher. He's in San Diego. He's helping people vote. And he's been reading this 400-page book that talks about each of the ballot questions, all of the different candidates. And he has this realization as people are showing up to the polls that they haven't read this 400-page book. And that, in fact, it's pretty crazy to expect people to have read this 400-page book. And so what he's trying to figure out is how do we get there? How do we get to this assumption that democracy requires this much work, that we have to research the poll questions, that we have to research the candidates and such. And he ends up saying, weirdly enough, that's a pretty brief moment in time. Up until the progressive era, so, the early 1900s, people are voting on very different things. In post-colonial elections, people are really voting on who's the most noble, most honorable member of society. You're basically looking for who's the big man that we want to lift up. And that's what the election is. It's basically people saying, this is the person that we like the best, not necessarily their positions, but who they are as an individual in our society. And then we're sort of lifting them up. We get into the 19th century, the 1800s, and we have party politics. And you join a party not because you're looking at all the nuance. You join the party because your parents were in the party. You join the party because everyone you work with, everyone in your trade is in the same party. And people are not having nuanced, reasoned political debates. They're literally going into bars and, knocking back a few drinks and getting the party ballot that's been filled out for them in exchange for, the beers or the punch that they got. And then they actually have to fight their way to the ballot box against other drunken folks from a different party. So that's what democracy looks like in the 1900s. So it's not until the progressives that we sort of get this, we should research all these things, we should be super knowledgeable about them. And Schutzen basically says, the interesting thing about the progressive reforms, the interesting thing about ballot initiatives, the secret ballot, what was called the Australian ballot, is that it basically reduces political participation by a factor of 2. We go from having 70% turnout to about 35% turnout. So we made democracy hard, and we made it a lot of work, and a whole lot fewer people participate in it. I think a lot of visions for democracy right now want to say, look, you can't ask citizens to be omnicompetent. You can't ask everyone to be knowledgeable about every issue. Maybe what you actually have to do is let people pick a couple of issues that they really care about and look to see if there are candidates that speak to them on that specific issue. The problem in some ways is that within a two-party system, what it means is that everybody has to express an opinion on every single issue. If we had a parliamentary system, if we had a broader way of selecting people, you could sort of say, I want this candidate. I really care about the environment. I think it's the most important thing that we should be working on right now, and I should find a way to sort of empower that person. But what we're hoping for is a media ecosystem that makes it possible for us to have these sort of healthy political debates. And I'm not sure that the idealized way that we think about those debates is how the world really works. We can have whatever debate we want to have about healthcare. In our country right now, what we can actually do about healthcare is incredibly narrow. It's incredibly limited in terms of what's sort of politically possible. And I think in some ways, maybe what we really want to be competing for is what should we pay attention to? And I think that's where media gets really interesting. Media is a chance for everyone to sort of say, this is the issue that I care the most about. And you've seen some of this even during your lifetime. You've probably seen at least a little bit of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement. These are moments where people are sort of showing up and saying, look, we actually have to address sexual harassment in the workplace. We actually have to talk about this. We have to talk about the fact that it's incredibly dangerous to be a black man in America and have an encounter with the police. We are now talking to a certain extent about whether our crazy, cruel immigration policy is the sort of nation that we want to be. And I would say that social media and the ability for people to sort of tell their story. So, look, social media is not the ideal space to have reasoned democratic discourse. It ends up being highly emotional. We end up isolated in our own echo chambers. But it might be very powerful space in which we can advocate for things that we need to pay attention to. So during your lifetimes, we've seen both the Me Too movement, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement. Those were movements where people used social media to basically say, look, we need to pay attention to sexual violence against women. We need to pay attention to the dangers that Black Americans, particularly Black men, face at the hands of police. We are now seeing right now people use social media as a way of protesting against this administration's policies on immigration that are basically making it impossible for people, both who are undocumented and for people who have the right to be in this country, to live freely in this country. And so making sure that those opinions make it into the discourse, that's something that social media might actually be very good at doing for us.
Yeah, but I also thought like social media is kind of a double-edged sword. Kind of you can use it to have these ideas about Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, but it's also used to promote very harmful movements like the alt-right or neo-Nazism or things that are like extreme leftist beliefs as well. So it happens on both sides. So I guess how exactly should us as consumers of social media, consumers of Instagram, consumers of TikTok, how should we go about looking at what's actually true, what's moral, and what's right for democracy? Because I feel like a lot of people see a lot of things on social media and they just take a side because it resonates with them emotionally, but it might not be backed with facts or the truth. So how should we kind of go about that?
So the upside of the current media environment is that it's got a lot more diversity, right? We're not hearing the same very
Next of all of
limited
that,
points
let me
of
sort
view.
of go after that question.
Oh, Pranav, you're unmuted. Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay. So the question was basically that social media is a double-edged sword. Not only are we seeing diversity of views, but we're also seeing far right points of views, maybe extremist left points of views. How do we sort of navigate this really complicated structure? And what I was saying in response to that is, in the broadcast era, we had really low diversity, but pretty high safety. You weren't going to hear a lot that was radical. The radical groups were kind of hard to find. You had to look for them. They existed. You had groups like the John Birch Society, which were, quite racist, quite far right. Certainly at earlier times, you had the KKK. But you couldn't necessarily go online and look up Stormfront and find the neo-Nazis. These days, we have a lot more diversity. And there are some real pluses of that diversity. You can get ideas on the table that deserve to be on the table and weren't otherwise getting heard. But it also means that there's some really terrible stuff that makes it on the table and that we end up debating. And what it really comes down to is that it's just harder. It just takes a lot more effort and a lot more work. It was pretty easy to be an informed citizen in the 1970s or 1980s. You turned on the TV at the same time as everybody else and you watched the evening news and you were pretty much going to be there. These days, you actually have to triangulate. You have to look at what's coming to you on your social feed, and then you probably need to go to a trusted source like the New York Times or the CBC or something like that and try to figure out how much of it do you believe or not believe. If you're really good about this, you're probably also reading something to try to broaden your worldview. I lean pretty heavily to the left. One of the newsletters that I subscribe to is called The Writing, Rightting, and it's links to right-wing media. And mostly I read it to sort of see what narratives are playing around and sort of laugh at what's being promoted by the other side. And then, every 10th link or so, I actually find something that I sort of go, oh, that's interesting. I actually, think that there's a point there, there's a writer that I might want to follow. This is way more work than it used to be. But that's the world that we're living in. And I think getting people used to doing that work rather than just accepting what's being fed to them by the algorithm is a big part of being a citizen at the moment.
Yeah, totally. And just one last thought, because I know we're a bit over time. Sorry about that. To kind of close out. So you just talked about kind of how I guess we should be more open to more perspectives as consumers of content. So do you, because I know like a lot of people, they're very stingent on one idea. For example, if someone has like a left-wing belief, I think it's not just if someone attacks their belief that's on the left, they don't just have a sort of like kind of logical reaction. They have sort of like an emotional reaction as well. They think of, oh, you're attacking my belief, you're attacking me, you're attacking my values, you're attacking the things I stand for. And that kind of leads to people not being open to the other side. And it leads to kind of this more polarization in social media and whatnot. So how do you exactly think we should be more open as a society? Because it is quite hard. I think human nature itself is wired against being open, but I think it is necessary to have, a civil discussion about politics. So how do you think we should go about being more open and being more inclusive of all opinions?
So the phenomenon that you're discussing is sometimes called affective polarization, AFFECTIVE polarization. And the idea is not only are we polarized around the political ideas, but we're polarized in the sense that we feel like we're members of different tribes. That when we're encountering a different point of view, we don't just see it as like a disagreement, we see it as almost like a moral wrong. Like, how can you possibly believe that? How can you be that sort of person? It is probably not a super healthy way to live in the world. If we end up believing that the other side is genuinely evil, it's really hard to sort of find a way to come together and compromise. One of the things that for me is kind of a secret weapon in all of this is that I spent a lot of my life working outside the United States. I spent most of my 20s and 30s working on technology throughout the global south. I spent a lot of time in sub-Saharan Africa. I spent some time in Central Asia. And having that ability to sort of look at things and say, oh, there's not just US left and right, there's a really wide range of different ways to approach a problem. And so not looking at this and just going, okay, Democrats right, Republicans wrong, but sort of looking at this and saying, how are the Chinese thinking about this? How are different groups of people in India thinking about this? How are people in South Africa thinking about this? If you can start looking at things and saying, oh, there is a huge multiplicity of points of view involved with this. But again, it's harder work, right? It's a really useful cognitive shortcut to sort of say the Democrats are right about everything and the Republicans are wrong about everything. It means that you always have an opinion. Whereas if you have to look at something more broadly, and you actually have to think about it, that's an enormous amount of work, and that frequently feels uncomfortable. We like knowing what we think. We don't like being uncertain. And we should actually be a whole lot more uncertain than we are. So I think a lot of this is sort of the bad news that like the cognitive shortcuts that we've gotten used to not only aren't helping us very much, they're probably hurting us quite a bit. And that if we picked a couple of issues that we as individuals really cared about and really read about them and understand about them and care about them, and then sort of talk to our friends about them. This is what I'm thinking about. This is what I'm studying. This is the theory that people have referred to as an interlocking public. So remember, I ended up saying the omnicompetent citizen is impossible. You can't be knowledgeable about everything. The only way you can do it is through cognitive shortcuts like Dems bad, Republicans good. But what you can do is pick a couple of things that you really care about, get smart about them, think about them, and then interact with your friends, interact with your peers, find out what else they care about. Collectively, maybe we're capable of actually being knowledgeable and thoughtful about a wide range of issues.
Thank you. That was honestly like a beautiful wrap up to the entire podcast. I wanted to ask you something a bit off the record.
Yeah.
I'll just include this, but I've been seeing a lot of like decisive action being taken, especially in like if you read about what happened in Bangladesh and Nepal recently, right?
Yep.
And with like the assassination of Charlie Kirk, how do you see polarization, especially like when we look at the digital age we're in? How do you see polarization affect these things, and where do you see the future taking us?
Well, so let me talk about Nepal, because that I actually understand a little bit about. I was in Kathmandu December of last year. I see that more as democracy kind of spreading. So you have a lot of Nepalis sort of feeling like there's a ruling class that doesn't include most average Nepalis. You were seeing a lot of political dissent on social media, particularly around this idea of nepotism, right? Like, here's a new generation of people coming up. You know, they're not as smart as their parents, they're not as accomplished as their parents, but they sort of assume that they're going to have power just because they're coming from powerful families. And so people start calling that out and essentially saying that's bullshit. I don't want to live within that system. And then social media gets cut off. And that's kind of a classic mistake. You don't want to shut people off of social media because then they go out in the streets. That's exactly what happened with Egypt with the Arab Spring. And so you had a very parallel movement to the Arab Spring movement. I don't know that it was necessarily extreme. There was some violence associated with it. But I think for the most part, it was actually a pretty impressive outpouring of democratic will. The Charlie Kirk case is tragic. I thought Kirk was a detestable individual. I thought he was not actually committed to debate. His organization has hounded friends of mine, you know, and made it impossible to do their job as teaching. But there's no world in which I advocate for political assassination. So I think it's horrific that that's what comes out of it. I think in some ways, this is what scares me so much about the United States, is that we are in a country where it's easy to get guns, and we're polarized to the point where it feels like maybe that's what someone has to do to make a point or to get attention. In some ways, the Nepal situation is encouraging in a way that the Kirk situation is incredibly discouraging. And I would hate to think that we're heading to the point where political assassination becomes part of, you know, life as usual in the US. We've had a surprising amount of political violence lately, whether it's people taking shots at Trump, whether it's Luigi Mangione, whether it's Charlie Kirk. It's not a great look for a democracy. Arguably what happened in Nepal was a better look for a democracy. Having a bunch of people essentially say, you're not going to shut us up, we're going to find a way to take to the streets and say something. That's something that democracies actually kind of have a history of dealing with. We don't like people and no one will hear us and therefore we're going to kill them. You know, that's a much uglier sort of social path. And so I'm not particularly thrilled that that's sort of where we're heading right now.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That just about wraps up everything we wanted to cover today.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know it's a bit over time.
No, it's my fault that it's over time. I'm giving you long answers to your really good questions. So I hope you got what you wanted.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome.
And before we go,
So,
do you have
yeah.
any questions for us?
How many episodes are you in? Is this number 2 or?
Yeah, number 2, yeah.
That's awesome. How did you find me? How did you end up deciding to reach out?
We've seen your work. Like I mean, you're pretty like famous, I would say, within like this kind of social media scene. Um, I heard like what you said about pop-up ads. I think you were the
Uh-huh.
creator of pop-up ads, and I heard like you said you regretted
I,
pop-up ads,
I
and
I certainly do regret it. Yes. Yeah.
yeah. So we've seen a lot about like your work and everything.
What else are you thinking about next?
We're not too sure. We want to probably get someone who's, I guess, like more like experienced this sort of viralization. So, I mean, we've talked about Zoran Mamdani, who is someone who
Yeah.
was viral. We're talking to you,
Yeah.
who's someone who knows a lot about this topic, and then we want to talk to someone who's like kind of getting all this knowledge into like they're the ones scrolling on TikTok and getting all this exposure. We want to talk to someone like that.
Got it.
Um,
So someone who's actually like a social media influencer, sort of coming,
Perfect. Yeah.
from that space. Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Um, I don't, there's a generation gap here, right? Like I know people who are reasonably effective at social media, but who are like professors of my generation, so they're not going to be exactly what you want.
Mhm.
I'll think about it and see if anybody else comes up. I do think thinking about, who's sort of in their 20s and is starting to emerge as like a political influencer would be really interesting. And I know that that's definitely something that I would want to listen to. I sort of feel like I'm getting a lot of millennial voices on politics, but not a lot of Gen Z voices on politics. So someone who's actually, managing to kind of ride that wave from a Gen Z point of view would be super interesting. So, but yeah, anyway, guys, I enjoyed it. If I can help with other things, just drop me an email and I'll see what I can do to help.
Thank you so much. You've been wonderful. Just
Oh, it's my pleasure. Really nice to meet both of you, and take good care.
thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, that was a lot.
Yeah. I think the part that really stuck with me was when he talked about how attention has become a commodity. Like we think of attention as just a neutral thing, people paying attention to content, but it's been turned into something that can be bought, sold, manipulated, optimized.
And the people who are best at manipulating attention aren't necessarily the people with the best information or the most expertise. They're the people who understand psychology and the algorithmic mechanics.
Which brings us back to Andrew Tate. He did not go viral because he had a novel insight or because he was offering genuine value. He went viral because he understood the game better than most people.
And here's what's scary. His strategy is now being copied. There are hundreds of creators using the same playbook. Create controversy, build an affiliate network, flood platforms with content, use polarization to maximize reach.
We're seeing it in politics, in health and wellness spaces, in financial advice content. The Andrew Tate model has literally become a template.
So let me ask you guys something. After doing all this research, after talking to Professor Zuckerman, do you think virality is fundamentally broken? Like, is this system just irredeemable?
I don't know if the system is irredeemable, but I think we can't pretend it's neutral anymore. Virality isn't just about good content rising to the top. It's about content that triggers specific psychological and algorithmic responses rising to the top.
And sometimes that content is just straight up harmful. The same mechanic that let hashtag #MeToo spread and bring attention to systemic sexual harassment, high arousal emotion, identity based sharing, algorithmic amplification, those exact same mechanics let Andrew Tate spread misogyny to millions of teenage boys around the world.
So it's a double-edged sword.
It's exactly a double edged sword where we've made the blade sharper and sharper, but we haven't built any safeguards to prevent it from cutting the wrong things.
I want to bring up one more thing before we move to our closing. Professor Zuckerman mentioned the fragmentation of the public sphere. The idea that we no longer have shared spaces where everyone encounters the same information.
Right. We're all in our own algorithmic bubbles.
And I think that's directly connected to the Andrew Tate phenomenon. Because there were millions of teenage boys being bombarded with this content while their parents, their teachers, people outside the demographic had no idea who he was.
Until teachers started seeing the effects in the classroom. until the harm became visible enough that mainstream media had to pick it up.
But by that point, he'd already reached billions of people. The viral spread happened in these segmented communities before anyone in a position to do something about it even knew it was happening.
And that's the challenge with content moderation at scale. By the time platforms notice that something's a problem, it's already spread too far to contain.
Which is why the solution probably isn't just better moderation. It's rethinking the entire incentive structure of these platforms.
Which, if I'm understanding Professor Zuckerman correctly, is the whole point of digital public infrastructure. Building platforms where the goal isn't maximizing engagement, it's facilitating healthy public discourse.
Right. But that requires political will, funding, and a fundamental shift in how we think about social media, which I'm not holding my breath for.
That's fair.
All right, so we've covered a lot today. Let's try to synthesize this.
We looked at Andrew Tate as a case study in weaponized virality. He used affiliate marketing to build a distribution network, created content designed for controversy and emotional reaction, and exploited algorithmic mechanics to reach billions of people.
We talked about how misinformation spreads through the same mechanisms as legitimate information, maybe even faster, because it's often more emotionally engaging and less constrained by accuracy.
And we heard from Professor Zuckerman about the broader consequences, how the attention economy is accelerating mistrust in institutions, fragmenting our shared reality, and making it harder to have productive civic conversations.
So here's what I want to leave you all with. Some questions to think about.
How do you see this playing out in other areas of your life? We talked about Tate, but think about politics. Think about health, misinformation during the COVID era. Think about financial gurus promising get-rich-quick schemes, pyramid schemes, etc. How many of these are using similar tactics?
And more personally, how do you stop this from affecting you? Because here's the thing, we're all susceptible to this. Even knowing how the mechanisms work, I still find myself drawn to content that triggers strong emotions or confirms what I already believe.
I think awareness is the first step. Just knowing that virality is often engineered, not organic, changes how you consume content. When something makes you really angry or really excited, pause before you share it. Ask yourself, why am I feeling this way? Is this information accurate, or is it just designed to trigger a response?
Be skeptical of people who build their entire brand on controversy. Be skeptical of content that positions you as part of a special group fighting against some vague enemy. Those are often red flags for manipulation.
And maybe most importantly, diversify your information sources. Don't get all your news or information from social media. Seek out experts, long-form journalism, sources that don't have a financial incentive to make you feel angry or scared.
But I also do want to acknowledge that this is hard. These platforms are designed by very smart people with enormous resources to keep you engaged. Expecting individuals to just willpower their way out of these systems isn't realistic.
Which is why, in the long run, we need systematic solutions, better platform design, better regulation, maybe even alternate models, like the digital public infrastructure Professor Zuckerman talked about.
And that requires civic engagement, demanding better from the companies that run these platforms itself, supporting politicians who take tech regulation seriously, and understanding that the status quo isn't inevitable.
Okay, quick personal confession time. How many times have you guys caught yourself falling for exactly the tactics we've been talking about?
Dude, all the time. Just yesterday, I was about to share this video with some political scandal, and I stopped myself. And I was like, wait, why am I so angry right now? Do I even know if this is real?
I found myself going down a rabbit hole of financial advice TikToks the other week, and I realized halfway through that every single creator was using the same template. Create urgency, position themselves as the guy who figured it out, and they don't know what you need to know, and then pitch a course. It's all the same.
Same pattern as state, just in a different domain.
Exactly. It's everywhere once you start looking for it.
So, real talk. What do we want people to take away from this episode?
I think virality isn't magic and it isn't random. It's engineered. and the people doing the engineering often don't have your best interest at heart.
Be critical. Be skeptical. Don't trust content just because it feels relatable or because lots of other people are sharing it.
And maybe start thinking about what kind of internet we actually want. Because the one we have right now is optimized for engagement and profit, not for truth or community or democratic discourse.
We can demand better. We should demand better.
Thanks for sticking with us through this deep dive. If you found this valuable, share it with someone who needs to hear it, especially if you know young people who are spending a lot of time on social media. Next time, we're looking at a question that came up a lot during our research. If virality is engineered and misinformation spreads faster than truth, what does that mean for elections, for public health, for climate change communication?
Basically, when the stakes are highest, does the current system make everything worse?
Spoiler alert, probably.
Great. Can't wait.
But we'll also talk about people who are trying to use these platforms for good. How do you spread accurate information in a system built to reward engagement over accuracy?
So, stay tuned for that.
Until then, question everything, trust carefully, and remember, when everyone is trying to be seen, who actually gets heard?